The Silent Witness. Chapter 1. The Awakening. She woke up with a start, her heart pounding in her chest as if it were trying to escape. The room around her was dimly lit, the shadows playing tricks on her disoriented mind. She sat up slowly, feeling the cold sweat on her skin. A dull ache throbbed in her temples, and when she tried to recall what had happened, her mind hit a wall of blankness. Panic set in as she realized she had no idea where she was, or who she was. She looked around the unfamiliar room, her eyes darting from one object to another, hoping something would trigger a memory. But nothing did. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse. It felt like a hotel room, but there were no personal touches, no clues to help her piece together her identity. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood, her knees shaky. Crossing the room, she caught sight of herself in a mirror. The reflection that stared back was of a woman in her late 20s, with tousled dark hair and wide, terrified eyes. She didn't recognize the face, not even a flicker of familiarity. A surge of nausea hit her, and she stumbled into the bathroom, gripping the sink as she tried to steady herself. "Who am I?" she whispered to the empty room, the words echoing off the tiled walls. There was no answer, of course, just the sound of her own ragged breathing. She splashed water on her face, trying to clear the fog in her mind, but it didn't help. The blankness persisted, an impenetrable void where her memories should be. As she stood there, clutching the edge of the sink, she noticed a small bruise on her wrist, like the mark of a tight grip. Her heart skipped a beat. Had someone hurt her? The thought was chilling, but she had no memory to support it. The sound of footsteps outside the door made her freeze. She hadn't noticed it before, but now she realized there was a tension in the air, an ominous silence that had been hanging over her like a shroud. She listened intently, her breath catching in her throat. The door creaked open and a figure stepped inside. A man, tall and imposing, with a stern expression etched onto his face. "You're awake," he said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. She shrank back instinctively, her heart racing. "Who are you? Where am I?" He didn't answer immediately, his gaze piercing as he studied her. "You don't remember, do you?" His tone was almost accusatory, as if her amnesia were a personal affront. She shook her head, feeling tears prick the corners of her eyes. "No, I don't remember anything. Please, just tell me what's going on." He sighed, a sound that was more weary than sympathetic. "You're in a safe place. That's all you need to know for now. But who am I? Why can't I remember anything?" The man took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "You're the only witness to a crime, a very serious crime. And until we can be sure you're safe, your memory loss might be the best thing for you." Her stomach twisted in fear. A witness? To what? The questions swirled in her mind, but before she could ask any of them, the man turned and left the room, locking the door behind him. She was alone again, with nothing but her fractured thoughts and the growing sense of dread. Whatever had happened to her, it was clear she was in the middle of something far bigger and far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The Silent Witness. Chapter 2. The Investigation. The hours passed slowly, marked only by the ticking of a clock somewhere beyond the locked door. She had tried to sleep, but the fear gnawing at her insides kept her wide awake. Who was that man? And what crime was she supposed to have witnessed? The questions circled endlessly in her mind, feeding her anxiety. Just when she thought she couldn't take the isolation any longer, the door opened again. This time, a woman entered, carrying a tray with food and a glass of water. She had a kind face, with soft features and eyes that seemed to hold some semblance of warmth. "Good morning," the woman said gently, setting the tray down on the small table by the bed. "How are you feeling?" She hesitated, unsure if she could trust this new presence. "I don't know. I still don't remember anything." The woman nodded as if she had expected that response. "My name is Dr. Ellis. I'm here to help you to see if we can't recover your memories." Dr. Ellis? The name felt foreign on her tongue, like it belonged to someone else's life. "Please just tell me what's going on. The man who was here before said I witnessed a crime." "What did I see?" Dr. Ellis's expression turned grave. "You're in a secure facility because you were the only person who saw what happened to a prominent figure. There's a lot at stake and some very dangerous people might want to keep you from talking. Her blood ran cold. Why can't I remember it? Was it too traumatic? It's possible, Dr. Ellis conceded. Amnesia can be a defense mechanism, your mind's way of protecting you from something too painful to confront. But we need to try and recover those memories, both for your safety and to bring justice to the situation. She stared at the untouched food on the tray, her appetite completely gone. How do we do that? We'll start with some basic exercises, things that might help trigger your memories. But I need you to be patient with yourself. This won't be easy and it won't happen overnight. A part of her was desperate to remember, to fill the empty void in her mind. But another part of her, the part that was scared and unsure, wondered if maybe it was better not to know. What if the truth was more horrifying than she could imagine? As if reading her thoughts, Dr. Ellis reached out and placed a reassuring hand on her arm. Whatever it is, you won't face it alone. I promise. The sincerity in her voice was comforting, but it didn't entirely erase the dread that lingered in the pit of her stomach. She managed a weak nod, though she wasn't entirely convinced. Let's start with something simple, Dr. Ellis suggested. She pulled a small notebook and pen from her pocket and handed them to her. Write down anything that comes to mind, even if it doesn't make sense. Sometimes, fragments of memories can surface unexpectedly. She took the notebook hesitantly and stared at the blank page. Her hand shook slightly as she gripped the pen, and after a moment she began to write. The words came slowly at first, disjointed and meaningless. But then a name appeared on the page, a name she didn't recognize but felt an odd connection to. Evan? She whispered, staring at the name. Who is Evan? Dr. Ellis's face remained neutral, but there was a flicker of something, interest maybe, in her eyes. Does that name mean anything to you? She shook her head, frustrated. No, but it feels important. Like it's on the tip of my tongue, but I just can't reach it. Don't force it, Dr. Ellis advised. We're making progress. Let's keep going. They spent the next hour going through similar exercises, but the name Evan was the only solid thing she could pull from the depths of her mind. Everything else remained hazy, like trying to see through a thick fog. As the session drew to a close, she felt more exhausted than when they had started, her mind heavy with unanswered questions. When Dr. Ellis finally left, she was alone once again, her thoughts turning over the name Evan. Who was he? Was he connected to the crime she had witnessed? And why did the mere thought of him fill her with such an overwhelming sense of fear and urgency? She had no answers, only the sinking feeling that time was running out. Whatever had happened, whatever she had seen, it wasn't just her life at stake. The Silent Witness. Chapter 3. The Missing Piece. The next morning, she awoke to the sound of voices outside her door. They were low, almost whispered, but the urgency in their tones was unmistakable. She pressed her ear against the cold wood, straining to catch any words that might give her a clue as to what was happening. Still no leads, a male voice said, frustration evident in his tone. We can't protect her forever. If she doesn't remember soon, we're going to lose our only chance. A second voice, softer and more measured, replied, She's making progress. Pushing her too hard could backfire. We need to be patient. She recognized the second voice as Dr. Ellis. The first, though, something about it sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't the same man who had visited her on the first day, but there was an edge to it that made her uneasy. Their conversation ended abruptly, and she scrambled back to the bed just as the door opened. Dr. Ellis entered alone, her face calm as always, though there was a tension in her posture that hadn't been there before. How are you feeling today? Dr. Ellis asked, her voice as soothing as ever. Confused, she admitted, and scared. I heard you talking outside. You mentioned that time is running out. What does that mean? Dr. Ellis hesitated, then sighed. There are people who want to find you to make sure you can't testify about what you saw. We're doing everything we can to protect you, but the longer it takes for your memory to return, the more dangerous the situation becomes. Who are these people? She pressed, her fear growing. Why are they after me? They're very powerful, Dr. Ellis said carefully, and very dangerous. I can't tell you more than that without jeopardizing your safety. She felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. But how am I supposed to remember if I don't even know what I'm trying to recall? We're going to try something different today, Dr. Ellis said, changing the subject slightly. She pulled a small device from her pocket, a voice recorder. I want you to listen to something. Dr. Ellis pressed play and a voice filled the room. It was deep with a slight rasp, and as soon as she heard it, her heart began to race. The voice was saying something mundane, a greeting, a brief introduction, but it was the tone, the cadence that made her blood run cold. Does this voice sound familiar? Dr. Ellis asked, watching her closely. She nodded, unable to speak as the voice continued to play. It was familiar, painfully so, but she couldn't place it. And yet, as she listened, flashes of images began to surface in her mind. A dark alley, the glint of a knife, the sound of footsteps echoing in the night. She gasped, clutching her head as the images came faster, more vividly. There was a man, a shadowy figure, his face obscured, moving toward her with purpose. And then a scream, a blood-curdling scream that pierced the air, reverberating through her skull. "Stop!" she cried out, her hands shaking violently as she pushed the recorder away. I can't. Dr. Ellis immediately stopped the recording, rushing to her side. "Breathe," she instructed gently. "Take deep breaths. You're safe here." She tried to do as Dr. Ellis said, inhaling and exhaling in slow, deliberate motions, but the images wouldn't fade. They clung to her mind like stubborn shadows, refusing to let go. "The voice," she finally managed to say, her voice trembling. "It was there, that night. Do you remember anything else?" Dr. Ellis asked softly. She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Just flashes. It's all jumbled, like a nightmare I can't wake up from." Dr. Ellis didn't push her further, instead offering a reassuring smile. "You're doing well. Even these fragments are important. They're pieces of the puzzle, and eventually they'll come together." But the words provided little comfort. The more she remembered, the more terrified she became of what those memories would reveal. And at the center of it all was that voice, a voice that haunted her even in the waking hours. As Dr. Ellis left the room, she collapsed onto the bed, exhausted from the ordeal. But sleep wouldn't come, her mind too restless with fear. The images continued to swirl in her thoughts, taunting her with the promise of answers just out of reach. Who was the man with the knife? And what had she seen that was so dangerous it had to be erased from her memory? As the day wore on, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the brink of something monumental. Something that, once remembered, could change everything. But was she ready to face it? The Silent Witness. Chapter 4. The Breakthrough. The days that followed were a blur of therapy sessions and sleepless nights. Dr. Ellis continued to push her gently, coaxing out fragments of memories that only served to deepen the mystery. Each new recollection was like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit, leaving her more frustrated and afraid. But the fear was nothing compared to the growing sense of urgency that gnawed at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away, that something, or someone, was closing in on her. And that voice, the one on the recording, it haunted her every waking moment, always on the edge of her consciousness. On the fourth day, Dr. Ellis introduced a new technique, a form of hypnosis that she hoped would help unlock the buried memories. The idea terrified her, but she was desperate to break through the fog that clouded her mind. "Just relax," Dr. Ellis instructed, her voice calm and steady as she dimmed the lights in the room. "Focus on your breathing. In and out slowly, that's it." She did as she was told, her body sinking into the chair as the tension began to ease. Dr. Ellis's voice was like a lifeline, guiding her into a state of deep relaxation. She felt herself drifting, the edges of her awareness blurring as the room seemed to fade away. "Now, I want you to go back," Dr. Ellis said softly, her words penetrating the haze of her mind. "Go back to the night of the incident. Let your mind take you there, but remember, you're safe. You're just an observer." A cold shiver ran down her spine as her mind began to obey, pulling her back to that night. The fog lifted, and she found herself standing in a dark alley, the sound of distant traffic echoing around her. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made her skin crawl. She looked down at herself and saw that she was wearing a long coat, her breath visible in the chilly night air. She was waiting for something, No, someone. She could feel the anticipation, the dread, building inside her. A movement caught her eye, and she turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows. The man was tall, his face obscured by the brim of a hat, but there was something about him that made her heart race. He walked with purpose, his footsteps echoing in the narrow alley. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, the memory came rushing back in full force. She had been there to meet someone. Evan. The name she had scribbled in the notebook suddenly made sense. Evan was a journalist, someone she had met by chance but who had quickly become important to her. He had been working on a story, something big, and he had needed her help. That night, they were supposed to meet so he could share what he had found. But something had gone horribly wrong. As Evan approached, she saw the fear in his eyes, the urgency in his steps. He was carrying a folder, clutching it to his chest as if it were a lifeline. He barely had time to speak before another figure stepped out of the darkness, a man she now recognized as the one from the recording. The man didn't hesitate. He pulled out a knife and lunged at Evan, the blade catching the dim light as it slashed through the air. She screamed, the sound tearing through her throat as she watched the scene unfold in horror. Evan tried to fight back, but he was overpowered, the man's knife finding its mark with brutal precision. She wanted to run, to do something, but she was frozen, paralyzed by fear. All she could do was watch as Evan collapsed to the ground, his blood pooling on the cold, hard pavement. The man stood over Evan's body for a moment, his face still hidden, before he turned his gaze to her. She felt her blood run cold as he stepped toward her, his expression unreadable. But then something unexpected happened. He stopped, a frown creasing his brow as if he recognized her. "You," he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. "You're not supposed to be here." Before she could react, the man grabbed her by the wrist, dragging her closer. She struggled, but his grip was like iron, unyielding and painful. He whispered something in her ear, words that sent a jolt of terror through her. But before she could fully comprehend what he was saying, there was a flash of blinding light, and everything went dark. She gasped as the memory faded, her eyes snapping open. The room came back into focus, and she realized she was trembling violently, her body drenched in cold sweat. Dr. Ellis was by her side in an instant, her expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. "What did you see?" she asked gently. She struggled to find the words, her mind reeling from the onslaught of memories. "Evan, he was killed. I saw it happen. And the man who did it, he knew me." Dr. Ellis's eyes widened slightly, but she remained composed. "That's a huge breakthrough," she said softly. "Do you remember what the man said to you?" She shook her head, frustrated by the missing pieces. "No, just that I wasn't supposed to be there. And then, I blacked out." "It's okay," Dr. Ellis reassured her. "You've remembered so much already. The rest will come in time." But as she sat there, her heart still pounding in her chest, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was the one thing she didn't have. The man who had killed Evan was still out there, and he knew she had seen everything. And now he would stop at nothing to find her. The Silent Witness. Chapter 5. The Chase. The revelation left her shaken to her core. 4 hours after the hypnosis session, she remained in her room, too afraid to leave, replaying the horrific memory over and over in her mind. Evan's face, the fear in his eyes, the brutal swiftness of his murder, it was all too vivid, too real. And the man who had killed him, the one who had known her, was still out there. When Dr. Ellis returned later that day, her demeanor was more urgent than before. "We need to get you out of here," she said, her voice low but firm. "You're in more danger than we anticipated." The words sent a fresh wave of panic through her. "But where will I go?" "He'll find me. He always finds me." "We have a plan," Dr. Ellis assured her. "We've been in contact with the authorities and they're arranging a safe house. It's in a remote location far from here. You'll be protected, but we need to move quickly." She nodded, her mind racing. The idea of leaving the relative safety of this place was terrifying, but staying meant certain death. There was no choice. Dr. Ellis handed her a small suitcase. "Pack only the essentials. We leave in an hour." She moved mechanically, her hands shaking as she threw clothes into the suitcase. The reality of the situation was sinking in, the weight of it pressing down on her chest. She wasn't just running from the memory of Evan's murder, she was running from the man who had killed him, a man who seemed to know her better than she knew herself. When the hour was up, Dr. Ellis returned with a man she hadn't seen before. He was tall, with a muscular build and a no-nonsense demeanor. "This is Agent Carter," Dr. Ellis explained. "He'll be escorting us to the safe house." Agent Carter nodded at her, his expression stern but not unkind. "We need to move fast. We've had reports of suspicious activity near the facility. It's possible they've already found us." Her heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? How could they have found us so quickly?" "There's a leak somewhere," Carter said bluntly. "But we don't have time to figure that out right now. We need to get you out of here." Dr. Ellis placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You'll be safe with Agent Carter. Trust him." She wanted to believe them, to trust that everything would be okay, but the fear was overwhelming. Still, she had no other option. With a deep breath, she nodded and followed them out of the room, her legs feeling like they might give way at any moment. The facility was eerily quiet as they made their way through the corridors. Agent Carter led the way, his hand hovering near the gun at his waist, his eyes scanning every shadow. Dr. Ellis stayed close beside her, offering silent support. They reached a back entrance where a car was waiting. Carter opened the door and gestured for her to get in. She hesitated, looking back at Dr. Ellis. "You're coming too, right?" Dr. Ellis smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'll be right behind you. Go on." She climbed into the car, her heart pounding in her chest. Carter got in beside her, while Dr. Ellis took the front passenger seat. The driver, another man she didn't recognize, pulled away from the facility with a sense of urgency that made her grip the seat. As they sped down the deserted road, she tried to calm her racing thoughts. The memory of Evan's death was still fresh in her mind, but now it was joined by a new fear. The fear of being caught, of the man who had taken Evan's life finding her and finishing the job. She looked out the window, watching the landscape blur by, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every passing car a potential enemy. The paranoia gnawed at her, making it hard to breathe. "Are we safe?" she finally asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Carter glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "For now. But we need to stay vigilant. They won't give up easily." His words did little to ease her mind. The tension in the car was palpable, and every minute felt like an hour. They drove for what seemed like forever, the road stretching out endlessly before them. The further they went, the more remote the area became, until they were surrounded by dense woods and narrow, winding roads. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the car turned onto a dirt path that led deeper into the forest. The trees closed in around them, their branches casting long shadows in the fading light. She could barely see the sky through the thick canopy. The car came to a stop in front of a small cabin, nestled deep in the woods. It was isolated, the perfect hiding place. But instead of relief, all she felt was a growing sense of dread. "We're here," Carter said, opening the door. "Let's get inside quickly." She followed him out of the car, her legs unsteady as they made their way to the cabin. The air was cold and the forest was eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of leaves underfoot. But as they reached the door, a loud crack echoed through the trees, a gunshot. She froze, her blood turning to ice as the sound reverberated around them. "Get down," Carter shouted, pushing her to the ground as he drew his gun. Chaos erupted around her. Another shot rang out, this one closer, and she heard the unmistakable sound of bullets hitting wood. Someone was shooting at them. Panic surged through her, and she scrambled to her feet, trying to run, but Carter grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the cabin. "Stay with me," he ordered, his voice harsh with urgency. They barely made it inside before more shots rang out, shattering the windows and splintering the wooden walls. She dropped to the floor, her heart hammering in her chest as Carter returned fire, his face grim with determination. "We're pinned down," he yelled, firing off another round. "Stay low and don't move." But even as she obeyed, pressing herself against the floor, she knew it was only a matter of time. They had been found, and this time, there was no escaping the man who wanted her dead. The Silent Witness. Chapter 6. The final memory. The gunfire was relentless, each shot tearing through the fragile sense of safety she had clung to. Glass shattered above her, raining down like deadly confetti as the attackers closed in. She could hear Agent Carter shouting commands, his voice tense, but there was no mistaking the underlying note of desperation. Dr. Ellis crawled across the floor to where she was huddled. The fear in the doctor's eyes was a reflection of her own, but there was something else there too, a steely resolve. "We can't stay here," Dr. Ellis whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "There's a trapdoor in the back. It leads to a tunnel. We need to go now." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak, and followed Dr. Ellis as they crouched low, moving toward the back of the cabin. Carter provided cover fire, his aim precise, but the odds were against them. The attackers were closing in, their bullets punching through the walls with terrifying accuracy. Dr. Ellis reached the trapdoor, hidden beneath a rug, and threw it open. The tunnel below was dark, the kind of darkness that swallowed all light, but it was their only chance. "Go," Dr. Ellis urged, pushing her toward the opening. She hesitated only for a second, then dropped into the darkness, her feet hitting the cold, damp earth below. Dr. Ellis followed, pulling the trapdoor shut behind them. The tunnel was narrow, forcing them to crouch as they hurried through it, the sounds of gunfire growing fainter but still too close for comfort. As they moved through the tunnel, the walls closing in around them, she felt the terror creeping back in. They were running, but she knew deep down it was only a matter of time before they were caught. The man who had killed Evan, he was relentless, and now he had her cornered. Dr. Ellis reached out, steadying her with a hand on her arm. "We're almost there," she whispered, though the strain in her voice betrayed her own fear. They emerged from the tunnel into the cold night air, the forest once again surrounding them like a protective cocoon. But there was no time to breathe, no time to feel any semblance of relief. Dr. Ellis grabbed her hand and pulled her forward, leading her deeper into the woods. The sound of footsteps behind them sent a jolt of panic through her. They were being chased. "Run!" Dr. Ellis shouted, and they both broke into a sprint, the branches tearing at their clothes and faces as they plunged deeper into the forest. Her lungs burned, her legs screaming in protest, but she didn't dare slow down. The footsteps were getting closer, the pursuit relentless. She could feel the presence behind her like a shadow, dark and ominous. And then suddenly Dr. Ellis stopped, pulling her behind a thick tree trunk. "Stay quiet," she mouthed, her eyes wide with fear. They pressed themselves against the tree, the bark rough against her back as the footsteps grew louder, closer. She held her breath, every muscle in her body tensed, waiting for the inevitable. A figure emerged from the darkness, moving with deadly precision. It was the man, the one from her memories, the one who had killed Evan. He paused just a few feet away, his head turning as if he could sense them hiding. She felt her heart hammering in her chest, each beat loud enough to give them away. The man stood there for what felt like an eternity, his cold gaze sweeping the area. And then, as if he had made a decision, he started to move again, his steps deliberate, calculating. As he passed by, something in her snapped. The fear, the helplessness, it all coalesced into a single burning need for answers. She couldn't run anymore, couldn't hide. She had to know the truth. Without thinking, she stepped out from behind the tree, her voice trembling as she called out, "Why? Why did you kill Evan?" Dr. Ellis gasped, trying to pull her back, but it was too late. The man stopped, turning slowly to face her, his eyes narrowing with recognition. "You remember," he said, his voice low and cold, as if her defiance was a mere inconvenience. She stared at him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I remember enough. You knew me. Who are you?" A twisted smile crossed his face, one that chilled her to the bone. "You were never supposed to remember," he said, taking a step closer. "But now that you do, I suppose it's time you learn the truth." Dr. Ellis stepped forward, her voice trembling with anger. "Stay away from her." The man ignored the doctor, his eyes locked on her. "Evan wasn't just a journalist," he continued, his tone almost conversational. "He was investigating something much bigger, something that involved very powerful people. People who don't like loose ends." Her mind raced, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. "And I was part of it, wasn't I?" That's why you tried to erase my memory." He nodded, almost approvingly. "You were in the wrong place at the wrong time, but you knew too much, so we made sure you forgot." Dr. Ellis moved between them, trying to shield her. "It's over. You won't hurt her again." The man chuckled, the sound low and menacing. "You think you can protect her? You think you can protect yourselves? You don't understand the forces at play here." In that moment, something clicked inside her, a final piece of memory that had been buried deep within her subconscious. "Evan, he gave me something," she said slowly, her eyes widening as she remembered. "A key to a safety deposit box." The man's expression darkened. "Where is it?" The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. The key was still with her, hidden in the lining of the coat she had been wearing that night. The coat that was now back in the facility. "You'll never find it," she lied, hoping to buy time. "It's gone." He stepped forward, raising his gun, his eyes cold and calculating. "Then you're of no use to me anymore." But before he could pull the trigger, a shot rang out. For a split second she thought it was over, that he had killed her. But then she saw the man stagger, his eyes widening in shock as blood spread across his chest. He fell to the ground, his gun clattering uselessly beside him. She turned to see Agent Carter emerging from the trees, his gun still smoking. "Are you two okay?" he asked, his voice breathless. She nodded, unable to speak, as the reality of what had just happened sank in. The man who had haunted her nightmares was dead, and with him, the answer she had been searching for. But there was one thing she knew for sure. Evan had trusted her with something important, something that could change everything. As she stood there, staring at the man's lifeless body, she realized that her journey was far from over. There were still questions that needed answering, still secrets to uncover. And now, with the key to those secrets in her possession, she knew there was no turning back.